you'd stay, and then you'd spend the night at the hospital for your on-call shift. And then at 8 o'clock the next day, you begin your next shift. And finally, you got to go home 33 hours after first showing up for work the day before. And there were weekends, right? We didn't have to work every weekend, but our little group of chaplain interns had to make sure that all the weekend shifts were covered. And so we regularly worked 70-hour weeks. And for this opportunity, we, the interns, how this worked, we, the interns, we paid the hospital. That's right. In the summer of 2007, I paid McNeil Hospital in Berwyn, Illinois, around $1,200 for the opportunity to work 70 hours a week for 3 months. All these years removed, that doesn't feel right. I'm not sure how it works these days, but I'm also not sure that it would have been particularly just if we had been paid. Because for all the time I spent there, I'm not sure that I provided much in the way of value to the hospital. I was 23 years old, and I was carrying around the most terrifying item I had ever held, a pager. And not just because even way back then, it was already an archaic piece of technology, but every time that pager went off, it meant that it was my duty to walk into the worst day of someone else's life. And in those rooms, I was terrified because of the gravity of the situations, but also because I had no idea what I was supposed to do, or more importantly, what I was supposed to say. So in a waiting room with the mother of a victim of a gang-related shooting, or the elderly Polish woman who just watched her husband die, what on earth did I know of life that I might say to them that might be some sort of solace? The appropriate advice that is given to young people who are in the embryonic stages of developing pastoral care skills is to listen. Entry-level pastoral care classes in seminary are focused on developing empathetic listening skills. And for those of us who did not feel like we had much of anything to say, this was a refuge. I like to think these days that I have above average listening skills. But sometimes just listening isn't always satisfying. Lately, I've had a number of pastoral conversations with some of our recent alums from Bread+Belonging, and it is, I want to say, just one of the best parts of my job to get a text that says, "Pastor Zach, I'm going to be in town next week. Let's get together." And these conversations very often center around the question of should. I'm in between jobs. I don't love this job, this career that I thought I would. I'm just not sure what I should do. What do you think I should do? In response to those questions, empathetic listening will only get you so far. But I get it, right? I too seek the kind of clarity that can seemingly come from only outside of ourselves. And as a pastor in these conversations, my care for these people stirs up in me an urge to solve their problems. I want to do everything I can to help the people I love. But the reality, of course, is that I don't really know the fullness of their situations, and I'm not a headhunter for corporations. And when it comes down to it, it's probably not the healthiest thing in the world to have someone else make your big decisions for you. And so I end up listening and giving the sort of responses that we typically think of Jesus giving, more questions in response to questions, leading hopefully ever deeper into the mystery of a life of faith. And that is what we think of Jesus doing most of the time in his encounters with folks, the people who come to him. He very often responds with his own questions, but you may have noticed today, that's not really what happens this week. Sometimes it's hard to pin Jesus down for a direct answer. And it seems to happen this week, and it's jarring. Some Pharisees come to him, and in their conniving manner, they ask, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? It's a question meant to entrap Jesus. It's a question that he typically, deftly maneuvers out of with his own clever questions. But here, Jesus is remarkably clear. First, Jesus shows that he's a Lutheran. He insults the Pharisees. Luther loved to insult people. He insults the Pharisees, but then in public and in private, he appears to say plainly that divorce has no place in the kingdom of God. Before we get any deeper into this text, a text that many traditions have used abusively and to promote brokenness in the world, we need to set a little bit of context. In the ancient Near East, in the society in which Jesus lived and taught, it's important to know there was no social safety net. Right? Think of the story of the Good Samaritan. And we typically read that story in shock at the apparent hardness of heart of the people who pass by, who do not stop to help the injured man on the road. But at the time, that story, the shock that we feel, the lack of care of the strangers passing by on the road would be transferred to the Samaritan. The shock that anyone would stop to help someone else in need is the shocking part. In the ancient Near East, the only people who had any responsibility for your care or well-being were your blood family. There was no general sense that unrelated people should look out for one another. It was a deeply tribal and familial society. And so knowing that reality, we can start to hear many of Jesus' teachings as solutions for the social ills of the day. For one, the Bible's repetitive admonitions to care for widows is in part a response to a world where widows regularly died, where they starved to death because no one would care for them because they had no obligation to do so. But the biggest problem in Jesus' society were familial rivalries. If your extended blood family were the only people who would care for you, you had to demonstrate absolute loyalty to that family in order that you might receive it. And so any small offense against anyone in a family became the duty of the entire family to seek retribution. And so entire communities would be destroyed by Hatfield and McCoy-style feuds, tits for tats that would never end. And that is the backdrop for Jesus' teaching here on divorce. Love marriage, a marriage entered into willingly and primarily by the commitment of two individuals, is a very new thing in terms of human history. But back then, marriage was chiefly an economic arrangement between two large families. It is on very few levels equivalent to what we now know as marriage. There were dowries to be haggled and the benefits of two families' economic cooperation to be considered. And the other important thing is to realize that this was not just a commitment back then between two people, but that everyone in those extended families were being joined together, were being joined in blood. They were becoming blood family members. Jesus emphasizes the flesh part of coming together and becoming one flesh, in part to communicate that these two large family systems were now becoming one family, that they were now all connected by blood, and that now the members of those two families owed one another the sort of commitment and loyalty that could easily demand your life. And so with this backdrop, you can imagine the scale of the pain and the brokenness that divorce could bring. It's the sort of thing that could and very often did lead to a feud that would last for generations. It's the sort of thing that is easy to see how God would not want that for us. But let's go back to that question the Pharisees ask, because I think it is their phrasing that leads to Jesus' clarity. The Pharisees don't ask if someone should get divorced. Right? We're not talking about a real person here who's considering divorce and asking whether Jesus thinks they should or not. Instead, the Pharisees ask if it is lawful. They ask a direct question about the law. And in response, Jesus points to Moses, the one who gives the law. And Moses says there is a process for making divorce happen. But Jesus also says that Moses teaches this because your hearts are hardened. And the question Jesus is answering is not about whether, given the complexities and brokenness of the world, whether a marriage should be allowed to dissolve. Jesus is answering the question of whether there is a place for divorce in the world as God would have it, in the world as it should be, in the world as it one day will be. And the good news this week is twofold. On one hand, Jesus points out our limitedness. He proclaims the law, the reality of our inability to fully live into the world and into the lives that God holds for us. He acknowledges that divorce is a reality for people who live in a hard-hearted world. But Jesus also proclaims the good news that while Moses compromises, while we must compromise, God will not. That in the end, the brokenness that tears apart couples, families, and societies will not stand, that these wounds will one day be fully mended. And so on this text and topic, I want to be clear. There are plenty of good reasons why people should get divorced. And yet it doesn't make divorce an inherently good thing. It creates wounds and scars that take a long time to heal. And truth be told, some marriages do just the same. And yet the good news that Jesus proclaims starkly and boldly this morning is the good news that those wounds will heal. And that might not mean reconciliation, but it does mean wholeness for each of us and for all of us. I can still remember viscerally the fear that seized my body every time that pager went off. I remember sitting in the chaplain's lounge on the rubber foam mattress in the middle of the night, staring at the pager, praying that it would not go off. And looking back, I wonder what that fear was. And I think it was not the fear that the afflictions of those in my care would, or even fear mostly of facing my own mortality. No, I think at the time, I was most afraid that the wounds I witnessed would not heal. It was my first experience with how real and painful life could be, and I could not yet see the possibility that God might ever heal such pain. And the promise this morning is for all of us who've ever found ourselves in that place, tending to our own wounds or to the wounds of others. And the promise is not what we always want. The promise of a future that one day will be doesn't magically solve our problems of today, but it does set a path before us. And may it be a path that we walk together. Amen.
Amen.